This is Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken, chapter 30. We're jumping in at page 300. If you remember chapter 29, I think it's one of the most painful chapters in the book to read. When there's some men who steal some things from the camp, and so all of those men and the officers are, they have to be hit by all of the other prisoners in the area. So that chapter is called 220 Punches, and there's just this scene of each of those men being punched in the face over and over and over again. And if you want to see the movie clip, I went ahead and added that to our playlist with the audiobooks. There you go. But we are jumping in today at chapter 30, which is called The Boiling City. Here we go. No one in Nuetsu was sleeping. B-29s crossed over every night, and the air raid sirens wailed for hours on end, competing with the roar of the planes. The sound of them and the sight of endless flocks of planes soaring unopposed over Japan sent the bird ever deeper into madness. Remember, we're nearing the very end of the war, and so Japan is determined not to surrender. They have a kill-all order for the prisoners, but the prisoners also know this is a good sign at some level because that means the Allies are winning the war. During the raids, the POWs were ordered to stay in the barracks with the lights out. Once the plane had passed, the bird would bound in, ordering the Americans outside. He and his henchman, Kono, would pace back and forth, shouting and swinging clubs, kendo sticks, or rifles. On some nights, the bird would shove the men into two lines, facing one another, and order them to slap each other's faces. Sometimes he and Kono would make them stand with their arms over their heads for 2 to 3 hours at a time, or force them into the Ofuna crouch, pounding them when they faltered. During one beating, Louis was clubbed on his previously injured ankle, leaving it so painful that he could barely walk. And on at least one of these nights, the bird beat Louis to unconsciousness. Louis's job as a pig custodian was over. Barge loading had also been canceled. Allied planes had sunk so many Japanese ships that none came or went from Nuetsu anymore. Louis was back on half rations. Limping, sick, and hungry, he begged the bird for work so he could get full rations again. Remember that if you're doing slave labor, you get a full ration of food, but if you're not doing slave labor, you only get a half ration. So even though the work is terrible and exhausting, at least you get a little bit more food. The bird brought him a paper-thin gray goat that appeared to be on the brink of death. "Goat die, you die," the bird said. Louis had nothing to secure the goat with and no pen to put him in. His friend Ken Marvin stole a rope from his work site and brought it to him. Louis tied the goat to a pole and began nursing him, giving him water and grain. At night, he tied him inside a grain shack. The goat only got sicker. One morning, the bird ordered Louis to come before him. He said that the goat had gotten loose, broken into a grain bin, and gorged himself. The animal was deathly ill, and it was Louis's fault. Louis knew that his knot had been secure. If the goat had gotten loose, someone had untied him. The goat died. Terrified of retribution or of payback, Louis tried to hide from the bird, but his dysentery was becoming very serious, so he's too sick to hide. Risking being seen by the bird, he went to the camp doctor to plead for medication. The bird ran him down, demanding to know if he had received permission to approach the doctor. Louis said no. The bird marched Louis away from the doctor's shack, passing Tinker and Wade, who had been ordered to work outside. Out in the compound, the bird halted. Lying on the ground before them was a thick, heavy wooden beam, some 6 feet long. "Pick it up," the bird said. With some effort, Louis hoisted it up, and the bird ordered him to lift it high and hold it directly over his head. Louis heaved the beam up. The bird called a guard over. "If the prisoner lowers his arms," the bird told him, "hit him with your gun." The bird walked to a nearby shack, climbed on the roof, and settled in to watch. I'm just going to tell you, this moment in the book is another scene that actually I think is really awesome and really powerful in the movie. So I'll go ahead and do the same thing. I'll put the YouTube clip of this scene in the playlist after this chapter. There's something about this moment that's just kind of nice to visualize. But basically picture this giant wooden beam, Louis lifting it high over his head. He's exhausted, he's sick, he's starving. So he doesn't really have any strength left, but he's going to lift this beam over his head because that's kind of what he has to do to fight for his life right now. Louis stood in the sun, holding up the beam. The bird stretched over the roof like a contented cat, calling to the Japanese who walked by, pointing to Louis and laughing. Louis locked his eyes on the bird's face, radiating hatred. Several minutes passed. Louis stood, eyes on the bird. The beam felt heavier and heavier, the pain more intense. The bird watched Louis, amused by his suffering, mocking him. Wade and Tinker went on with their work, stealing anxious glances at the scene across the compound. Wade had looked at the camp clock when Louis had first lifted the beam. He became more and more conscious of how much time was passing. 5 more minutes passed, then 10. Louis's arms began to waver and go numb. His body shook. The beam tipped. The guard jabbed Louis with his gun, and Louis straightened up. Less and less blood was reaching his head, and he began to feel confused, his thoughts gauzy, the camp swimming around him. He felt his consciousness slipping, his mind losing adhesion, until all he knew was a single thought: he cannot break me. Across the compound, the bird had stopped laughing. So the bird figured this is something that Louis would, he'd be crushed by the beam, by this giant log, almost immediately. But now Louis is so determined to not let the bird beat him, to not be broken, that this has kind of become a showdown between Louis and the bird. Time ticked on, and still Louis remained in the same position, conscious and yet not, the beam over his head, his eyes on the bird's face, enduring long past when his strength should have given out. Something went on inside of me, he said later. I don't know what it was. There was a flurry of motion ahead of him, so a bunch of motion. The bird leaping down from the roof and charging toward him, enraged. Watanabe's fist rammed into Louis's stomach, and Louis folded over in agony. The beam dropped, striking Louis's head. He flopped to the ground. When he woke, he didn't know where he was or what had happened. He saw Wade and some other POWs, along with a few guards, crouched around him. The bird was gone. Louis had no memory of the last several minutes and had no idea how long he'd stood there. But Wade had looked at the clock when Louis had fallen. Louis had held the beam aloft for 37 minutes, which, if you're not sure how long that is, grab something heavy around you and just hold it straight up over your head for like 3 minutes, and you will realize 37 is a very, very long time. On the night of August 1st, sirens sounded and the village shook. In the barracks, the POWs looked out and saw wave after wave of super fortresses. In the skies over Japan that night, America was staging by far the biggest air raid by tonnage of World War II. 836 B-29s bearing more than 6,100 tons of bombs, incendiaries, and mines. The POWs working the factory night shifts ran for the beach shelters, but the planes bypassed Noetsu. In Nagoka, 40 miles away, civilians looked up and thought it was raining. The rain was napalm, which is a chemical that's going to destroy everything on the ground. With the bombers sweeping overhead, the birds stormed into the barracks and shouted for all Americans to get out. As the men lined in the compound, the bird and Kono picked up their kendo sticks, walked behind them, and began smashing them over their heads. Men started falling. When Louis went down, the bird crouched over him, clubbing him. Woozy, Louis lay there as the bird and the sirens screamed. At dawn, the sirens went silent. The POWs on the beach came out of the shelters. In the compound, the bird and Kono went still. Louis stumbled to his feet and looked to the northeast. The edge of the world was glowing. Nagoka was burning down. That same night, B-29 showered leaflets over 35 Japanese cities, warning civilians of coming bombings and urging them to evacuate. The Japanese government ordered civilians to turn the leaflets into authorities, forbade them from sharing the warnings with others, and arrested anyone with leaflets in their possession. So the Allied forces are going to bomb a civilian area. It's not just military, and so they're warning civilians, non-military people, that they need to get out or they'll be killed. And so the government, which remember is never going to surrender, they see that as shameful, they're saying, nope, stay, give us the leaflets. Up here, if you look above to the picture, it says one of more than 5 million leaflets dropped over 35 Japanese cities on the night of August 1st and 2nd, 1945, warning civilians that heavy bombing was coming and they needed to evacuate. So this is what the leaflet looked like. It had the picture and then says, bombing's coming. That night was a turning point for Louis. The next morning, his dysentery was suddenly extremely severe. He was dangerously dehydrated and began to have trouble eating. Each day he was thinner, weaker. Every day and night, the B-29s raked over the sky and the bird rampaged through the camp. Remember, the bird has been getting more and more angry and unpredictable as Japan's been losing the war, and so as the B-29s come, his rages get worse. He attacked Ken Marvin, knocked him unconscious, roused him with a bucket of water to his face, told him to take care of his health, then knocked him out again. While Louis hid upstairs on his bunk, sick with fever, he saw the bird and Kono beat 2 sick POWs until they acquiesced or until they gave in to the bird's order to lick excrement from their boots. So they finally gave in to an order to lick poop off people's shoes. On another day, Louis looked across the compound to see the bird and Kono standing before a line of POWs, holding a confiscated book on boxing and taking turns punching the prisoners. Louis was walking in the compound when the bird collared him and dragged him to the overflowing Benjo pit. Remember, this is the bathroom. After pulling over several men, the bird forced Louis and the others down on their stomachs on top of the waste pits and ordered them to do push-ups. Louis was just barely able to hold his body clear of the pit. Others were not so fortunate. When the exhausted men failed to push themselves all the way up, the bird pressed the butt of his rifle to their heads and ground their faces into the waste. So not only are they starving, but they're being humiliated day after day. And it's just torturous, right? We've continued to talk about the importance of maintaining your dignity and your humanity through situations, and that's a lot of what keeps you alive. And these men are having their dignity and their humanity taken away. Then came the day that Louis had been dreading. He was standing outside, filling a tub of water, when the bird barked at him to come over. When Louis arrived, the bird looked wrathfully at him and gestured toward the water. "Tomorrow, I'm going to drown you." Louis spent a day gripped with fear, looking for the bird, thinking about the tub of water. When the bird found him, he was terrified. "I have changed my mind," the bird said. Then he lunged at Louis and began punching him in the face, alternating right and left fists in a violent ecstasy. So he's happy and enjoying this violence. As abruptly as he had started, he stopped. Suddenly serene or peaceful, he let go of Louis. "I will drown you tomorrow," he said. The bird strolled away. His face wore the same soft languor that Louis had seen on the face of the quack after he beat Harris at Ofuna. It was an expression of sexual rapture, meaning he's taking sexual pleasure from the pain that he's causing these other prisoners. And Laura Hillenbrand tells us this because we should be extremely disturbed by this, not only by the treatment of the prisoners, but really by how much pleasure the bird takes in harming other people. That should upset readers. Louis could take no more. He joined about a dozen officers in a secret meeting. By the time they parted, they had a plan to kill the bird. The plan was simple. The men would leap onto the bird and pull him to the top floor of the barracks, overlooking the drop to the Hokura River. There, they would lash him to a large rock and shove him out the window. When he struck the water below, the rock would carry him under. He would never draw another breath. The officers divvied up the tasks involved in the killing. A group of men would figure out how to overpower the bird, who was quite fit and would be difficult to subdue. Several of the biggest POWs would find a heavy but portable rock and, out of view of the guards, hoist it up the ladders and roll it to the window. Louis was tasked with stealing enough strong rope to lash the rock to the bird. Louis couldn't find a rope long enough to tie a man to a boulder. He began stealing shorter lengths of rope, secreting them away, then tying them together with his strongest Boy Scout knots. Meanwhile, the rock crew found a large boulder big enough to drown the bird and several other men. Somehow they got it into the compound, into the barracks, and up the ladder without discovery. They positioned it by the window. When Louis had finally stolen enough rope, he tied it into one long line. It was looped around the rock, a dangling end lying ready to be wound around the bird's body. Louis then prepared for the second phase of the plan. He had volunteered to be one of the men to capture the bird, drag him up, and throw him to his death. As the conspirators planned, conspirators are the planners of this, illegal thing, the bird entered the barracks. If the rock was then in place, he either didn't see it or didn't recognize what it was there for. He dug through the men's possessions. Under the tatami mat of an English officer, he found a piece of paper on which were listed the crimes of each of the Japanese officials. When the bird looked up, he saw the man sneering at him, so making a face that's like angry but making fun of him a little bit. The bird was spooked. He believed that he saw the POWs glaring murderously at him. They had never looked at him in this way before. He knew that Japan was losing the war and that when the end came, the Americans would try him, meaning they would put him on court. These POWs would accuse him of crimes, and the Americans would surely sentence him to death. No one, he knew, would defend him, and that fact left him angry and panicked. He was going to have to go to extreme measures to save himself. Next to a window near which the bird passed each day, the rock and rope sat ready. From the barracks window, it was a long plunge to the water. Now, it seems a little crazy that they're plotting to murder him at this point, but thinking about how much torture, how much humiliation they've suffered just because of the bird, it kind of becomes a natural place that these men get to, right? And so we understand what the characters are doing. At 2:45 in the morning of August 6, 1945, a B-29 skipped off runway Able on Tinian Island. At the yoke was Paul Tibbets, a veteran bomber pilot. The plane headed north toward Japan. The mission was so secret that Tibbets carried cyanide capsules, so it's a little capsule of poison, for all of the crewmen to be used if they crashed and they were captured. That means that rather than be captured and be forced to tell what they were doing, if they crash, these men are supposed to take poison so that they'll die, and no one will find out what the mission was because it's so top secret. As the day's first light walked over the Pacific, the plane rose toward its bombing altitude, more than 30,000 feet. 2 crewmen climbed into the bomb bay. There sat a 12-foot-long, 9,000-pound bomb called Little Boy. The men dropped to their hands and knees and crawled around the bomb, pulling out test plugs and replacing them with firing plugs. Little Boy was armed. My World War II buffs, your minds should be reeling right now, because you know what Little Boy is. Crossing the inland sea, Tibbets saw a city ahead. A scout plane flying over it radioed back in code. The weather was clear. They wouldn't have to bypass the city and pursue the alternate targets. Tibbets spoke over the interphone. It's Hiroshima. The plane passed the coastline and crossed over the city. Tibbets turned the plane west, then ordered his crew to don shaded goggles. Before he saw a T-shaped bridge, the target. Tibbets surrounded the control of the plane to the Norden bomb site, and the bombardier lined up on the bridge. Now, those of you who maybe aren't my World War II buffs, Hiroshima is the site of the atomic bomb dropping, one of 2. And so there's never been an atomic bomb dropped on a city with people in it until this moment. And it's going to be the most destructive bomb ever used. And it's used in a place where civilians are living, right? So that's what's going on right here. At 8:15:17, the bomb slipped from the plane. Tibbets turned the plane as hard as he could and put it into a dive to gain speed. It would take 43 seconds for the bomb to reach its detonation altitude, a little less than 2,000 feet. No one knew for sure if in that brief time the bomber could get far enough away to survive what was coming. One of the crewmen counted seconds in his head. When he hit 43, nothing happened. He didn't know what he'd been counting too quickly. For an instant, he thought the mission had failed. Exactly as the thought crossed his mind, the sky over the city ripped open in a firestorm of color and sound and felling wind. A white light 10 times the intensity of the sun enveloped the plane as the flash and sound and jolt of it skidded out in all directions. The tail gunner, looking out the back of the plane through his goggles, thought the light had blinded him. Tibbets' teeth began tingling, and his mouth filled with a taste of lead. This is because of the radiation from the atomic bomb. He would later be told that it was the metal in his fillings resonating with the radioactivity of the bomb. He looked ahead and saw the entire sky swirling in pink and blue. Next to him, the co-pilot scribbled 2 words in his diary, "My God." Behind him, the tail gunner's vision cleared, and he saw an eerie shimmering warp in the air over the city, rippling toward them at 1,000 feet per second. "Here it comes," he said. The shock wave slammed into the plane, pitching the men into the air and back down again. In confusion, someone yelled "flak," then a second wave, a consequence of the force of the explosion hitting the ground and then ricocheting upwards, smacked them, and the plane heaved again. At POW Camp 10D on the far side of the mountains by Hiroshima, prisoner Farron Cummins felt a concussion roll down from the hills and the air warmed strangely. He looked up. A fantastically huge, roiling cloud, glowing bluish-gray, swaggered over the city. It was more than 3 miles tall. Below it, Hiroshima was boiling. Now, you might have heard of a mushroom cloud. There's just a picture on my phone of Hiroshima and what that looked like. So like it said, that's 3 miles tall, just this giant cloud. Again, humans had never seen anything like this, most destructive bomb that had ever been used. So we leave off not really knowing how Louis doing, but as people who are reading the book long after the war, we know that this is nearing the end of World War II. There's one more thing that's going to happen, but this is the very end, and this bomb will be kind of what forces Japan to surrender. So we're going to pause there. Louis not in a great spot, but good things ahead for the end of the war, and we'll continue next time.